Hello. Welcome to number 30. Don't really have too much to say in the intro, so let's get right in there. What does the live balance team do in a day in the life? I'm going to put some qualifiers on this. First being that I can give like my personal like general experience, but the experience on live pod, which I'll talk about what exactly is the live pod in a second, is very different based on like what discipline you're in, and what your allocation looks like, and I'll explain that in a bit. But first of all, let me talk about like what even is the live pod, because people say like the balance team or the live balance team. Neither of those are teams that exist, right? What actually exists is a team called the Summoner's Rift team, which is responsible, as you might guess, for Summoner's Rift and generally the live maintenance of the game. It actually owns a little bit more than the Summoner's Rift experience, because there's also stuff that touches on other modes as well that SRT owns, but we're not going to get into that. The main pod that we're looking at here is what's called the live pod. And there's a foil to the live pod, which is the seasonal pod, right? If you have heard me talk about this before, you might know that for most of my time since I've come back to working on League from after I was working on Wild Rift, which was in 2023, I've spent most of my time working on the seasonal pod, but I've also worked some on the live pod. And the difference between the two teams is mostly time scale. The live pod covers things that are shorter term, not necessarily just patch to patch balance work. They also work on things that are a little longer term, like say some mid scopes or some systems or patchwork. And the seasonal pod works on stuff that's longer term that takes a lot more time and resources in order to make it work, right? As an example of two projects, for timescales, like role quests were a seasonal project, right? Where that took a lot of time and a lot of effort, and a lot of resources to make work. Right, we had to have an engineer working for several weeks in order to make a seventh item slot that we could put stuff in that actually worked and displayed all of the tooltips and stuff correctly, because the original game was designed with six displayable item slots in mind. Kind of fun actual like anecdote here, or like note, is that there's actually a lot more item slots in the game. You just can't see them. Like for example, recall goes in one of your item slots, but we don't need to get into all of that here. Anyway, getting back to the actual topic. Uh, the time scale is the difference between live and seasonal pod. And so the live pod, which is what people would typically consider like the balance team, is the one that is the pod that deals with patch to patch balance changes for the most part. But they also deal with things like, say, some mid scopes, not all of them, but some mid scopes, and some larger scale work. Two projects that are really good examples of this are role quests are for seasonal, right? Or work role quests were made by seasonal. As a large scale, like this is going to take several months to make and plan out. And the lane swap detected was an urgent, emergent thing from pro play that we wanted to make on live to make changes to pro play. And so live pod actually made that in about a month in early 2025. That was like basically all of the allocation of the live pod at that time. Like everyone that was allocated to live pod was just working on lane swap detected, and they were able to ship that and get that out, and have that working on live about a month later. And so uh, the big difference on SRT between those pods is just how long is the work going to take for the most part, where anything that's like more than a month is probably going to seasonal, and anything that's a month or less is probably going to live. Not universally true, but usually true. So that's the live pod. We're going to be talking about the live pod. So there's two different types of days for live pod. But before I even get into that, let me explain like actually no, let me explain the two different types of days first, and then I'll talk about the allocation stuff. So there's two different types of days. These aren't officially named. Call them like patch days, versus non-patch days. But basically there's a window of time on uh, every other week, a Monday, a Tuesday, and a Wednesday morning. There's this really a great window of time where after the patch has been shipped on the previous days, right? So this is, we work in LA, so this is like Pacific time and in the West Coast time in the US. The patch gets shipped on like a Tuesday night slash like Wednesday very early on in the morning. If you go to the next week, we have roughly about 5 days ish worth of data on that Monday morning. So we have great data. So even something that's relatively narrow, like a relatively niche champion in an off role building a weird item or something like that, we'll have good data on that, because 5 days, people play a lot of League in 5 days, it turns out. So we'll have good data to work with from the patch that just got shipped. But we don't lock the following patch until basically Wednesday at noon ish, is when the following patch gets like soft locked, if that makes sense, right? It's not literally like completely locked down. We can still make changes on, the Thursday or the Friday, or even really if we really want to, like the Monday, before the patch gets shipped or something like that. But generally, we want the stuff to be, that we want the stuff that we're going to be doing in that patch to be locked down so that it can be fully QA'd, so that engineers can actually, start packing that up and start getting ready to get sent to players. And of course, we have to start working on localization because the patch notes have to be translated to all these different languages and so on and so forth, right? There's a lot of prep time that needs to be done. And so that 2.5 day window, that Monday, Tuesday, and Wednesday morning before the following patch gets locked, that is when things are intense for the live pod. And that split between the two different types of days for live, like that intense 2.5 days versus the 7.5 days, in the rest of the cycle, like the rest of the patch cycle where they're not as intense. That split is why there's typically like a good number of people on the live pod that don't have 100% of their allocation to the live pod, right? For a lot of other, for a lot of other teams, especially for designers, their allocation is often like 100% to that team, right? Like, oh, you're just a designer or a QA and you just work on, say, the champions team, for example, or oh, you just work on the personalization team that's skins and other stuff. But for live pod, it's actually pretty common for designers and for other disciplines like, say, QA or engineers to be partially allocated because live pod needs a lot of people working on live during that 2.5 day window when there's a lot of work being done around like, oh, we need to change this thing, we need to change that thing. To generally talk about the workflow, the way that it works is basically there's a meeting on Monday and people, like, I'm not going to talk about the exact process of how this happens, but basically people bring pitches to that Monday meeting, and they get essentially the entire list of pitches, like proposals for like buffs and nerfs and systems changes and all of that sort of stuff gets run through and basically thumbs up or thumbs down by whoever is the current owner. That's currently Froxon, for example, and then those get assigned out. There's a bunch of different ways over the years that we've used to assign those out. I'm not going to talk about that because it's not that important. But then, as someone who's working the Lockbot as a designer, you are given these tasks, and over the course of Monday and Tuesday, it's expected that you basically post up like, "Hey, I have a task to nerf Hecarim by 1%. Here is my proposal for that list," and then that will get thumbs up, thumbs down. If it's thumbs up, you put it in. You lock it down. You get that QA'd, and it gets sent off into the next patch. If it gets thumbs down, it's going to depend on what happens there. It could be, hey, this is a really interesting change, but we want to hold on to this. We want to actually try it out. Hey, this actually probably won't hit magnitude. You should increase the numbers, or this is too much. You should decrease the numbers, right? All sorts of stuff like that, right? Like lots of people will comment, and it's actually really that socialization I think is actually really good. I think there's a lot of value in that I've found. Where, hey, you suggest a buff or a nerf for this champion, and someone says like, hey, have you considered this other thing that maybe you did or didn't consider, or hey, have you considered that we're also making this other change in this patch, or that this other thing changed recently, and you could consider that in relation to this thing, and maybe you should go harder or go less hard because of that thing, or you should do a different change because of that, right? There's a lot of people in the content channel where the lists get posted and basically anyone can comment, right? Like only there's one person that has the final say, which again currently is Broxon, on whether something is shipped or not. But almost pretty much anyone who's in that channel, which again is a lot of people, can comment and say like, hey, I think this is a good idea for A, B, or C reason, or hey, I think you should probably consider something else for X, Y, or Z reason. And so that's a hectic 2.5 days. You might note that we don't test a lot of these things in game. We actually used to do that. And what we found pretty consistently was that, hey, testing, +5 damage on, Ezreal's Q, or, -30 base health on Jinx or whatever, you don't really get anything out of it. And so some of these we will say, hey, we really want to test this before we ship it. And we will do that. And sometimes we'll say, hey, this is really interesting, but we don't want to ship this immediately because there's some things that could go really wrong. Let's actually test this. And so that's one of the cases that happens sometimes where people will be saying, hey, this thing was really obvious from the data from last patch. Why didn't Riot, or why didn't the balance people do anything about this? Sometimes what happens is we found something, we have a proposal on the table that we think is really interesting, and what happens is we pull that list from the patch and plan on shipping it in the next patch because we actually want to test it internally a bit and see what it looks like. And sometimes we end up not shipping that. We ship something boring, and people will say like, oh, well, if you were just going to change, nerf this ratio by 10%, why didn't you just ship that in the previous patch? This was so obvious. It's like, well, it's because we were trying something that we thought might be more exciting or might be better, or might be a more interesting or better direction for the champion. And sometimes we ship them and sometimes we don't, right? But I think it's good that we have the ability to like quickly iterate and try stuff out and then test it internally if it doesn't work out. Anyway, so talking about the allocation, because so much of the intensive work is done during that 2.5 day window, a lot of people that work on live are not 100% allocated to live. Like, again, designers especially, but like my experience, for example, most of the time that I worked on live, I was not 100% allocated to it. I was 50% and then 50% on seasonal, or sometimes a different number. Sometimes it was 25%, sometimes it was 40%, whatever, right? And that basically represents like how many days out of 10 am I working on live versus seasonal. But it's fairly common because live needs a lot of hands and a lot of effort to work on things in that 2.5 day window. There's a lot of people that tend to be partially allocated, right? Whereas the lead, whoever the lead is always 100% allocated, right? Like that was Freak, for example, for quite some time, and is not currently Freak. But the lead is always allocated heavily onto live, but a lot of the other people aren't 100%. Sometimes there are, right? Like, for example, we had a long-standing 100% allocation person that was working on live in like 2024 and 5. Anyway, I don't need to spin off into that. But yeah, so there's a lot of people that will be partially allocated to live. And then the question becomes, okay, so I've talked about the intensive, 2.5 patch days that happen every cycle. What about the rest of the time? And that's when things get worked on, like patchwork, right? For designers especially, right? Where, for example, you might be working on a midscope or some systems change that you think might be valuable, or hey, we had this change that we didn't ship because it was risky, and also stuff that follows up on the patch days, right? As an example, localization, right? The translation of the patch notes, or the original copy of the patch notes that then gets translated, that doesn't get finalized in that 2.5 day window, and so most people will be working on writing up their patch note context on like the Thursday or the Friday, or like updating lists and fixing bugs, right? Like for designers, right? QA and engineers, QA, for example, might be, hey, we're investigating live bugs, right? Like the live pod QA owns the live environment, right? And so that's the QA that's responsible for logging, not necessarily getting fixed, but logging anything that has to do with the live environment. And so, that's like in the past, that's been Galaxy Smash. If you've ever seen Galaxy Smash on Reddit, like commenting on people like, hey, do you have a clip of this bug or whatever? He was the live QA for a couple of years there, and was one of the people who was investigating that kind of stuff, right? Engineers, of course, are they're getting everything for the patch ready, actually locking it up and shipping it out, and so hopefully that's a decent rundown of day in the life. I was able to keep this take a little bit in a more reasonable in time, but hopefully that gives you a good understanding of like what it looks like to work on live. And if not, let me know. I'm down to redo this question if people think this was a bad rendition of it. So, thank you. Why doesn't Aurora's passive count as an on-hit effect? So I often I don't take in these questions about these like minute details of champions. This one though, I sort of meet the two qualifications of what I consider to be like worth answering for this space. Is like, one is I actually have full context because I've talked to Aurora's designer quite a bit about this, specifically this squad 5. And number two, I think this actually ties into a more interesting sort of general question. And so let me talk about this one specifically. So the reason why I know the specific details of this is because I actually, when I was working on Dusk and Dawn at the end of last year, and I was going through the entire list of all champions in the game, making sure that it worked correctly, with everyone, and the QA that was working with me flagged this as we don't know if this is supposed to work or not, and so I went to Squad 5 and said, how do you want this to work? I'm not as I'm making Dusk and Dawn, I don't have a particularly strong feeling about whether this is supposed to be on hit or on attack. At the time, I was like, it's currently on attack. Do you want it to be on hit? Because previously that didn't really matter that much, right? Like Rage, was this champion ever going to buy a Rage Blade? Probably not, right? So this was making it relevant, right? And so I brought the question to him. And basically, we had a conversation about it, and his perspective, which I think is very reasonable, is like, look, the reason why Aurora passive works on attacks is not so that she can be a primary attacker, right? It's not so that she can get primary value out of her attacks. The focus of Aurora is supposed to be on her spells. And so this should be an on attack effect because we don't actually want it to scale or interact with these attack-based systems. The goal of her being able to trigger it with attacks is that it's a 3-hit passive that doesn't have a cooldown, and so you will often get yourself in situations where if you say miss a spell, or you just hit someone with Q and you don't want to E them, the only way you can trigger a passive is if you have a like lower cooldown, like with your attack, way to add some extra stacks. And in fact, her basic combo with her ultimate will put someone at an uneven number of stacks, right? A non, multiple of 3 number of stacks. It's 4, because your ultimate will also apply one, right? And so the attacks are there to give Aurora something to do and a reason why she doesn't just, position perfectly for her next spell rotation. But uh, they're not the passive applying on attacks is not there to say, oh, you should build attack speed and only, frag people with your passive and not worry about your spells at all, right? The goal of the champion is to be a spellcaster, right? Not a primary attacker. And so by making it an on attack rather than an on hit, it's clear that the focus is on the spells and not the attacks, right? Because if it were an on hit, there's potential to end up focusing down the line onto an attack based build, which was not the goal for that champion. Now, I think there's a real question here around, well, could there be better communication or visualization of this? Absolutely, right? I think that as an example, I don't even think the terms on attack and on hit are good terms, right? These are basically like we basically like shipped our like internal like terrible like tech terminology, right, for these, where we have like from a tech perspective we have a hit effect and we have a this triggers when you attack, and these are not good names, right? We could probably rename these at some point, and I think we could definitely do a better job of communicating what is one and what is the other. I think there's value in the distinction from a design perspective, but the way that we present this to the player is not very good, I don't think, right? I don't think that it's very functional or like understandable as a player. Like there's a easy explanation which I can give you, but it's not intuitive at all. Which is on attack is I fired an attack, this effect will apply, and on hit is I literally hit the person, right? Which is why we have things that double on hits, because you're not like we don't have a thing that gives you an extra attack. That's like Titanic Hydra, for example, resets your attack so you can attack again. That's another attack, right? Whereas an on hit is just I hit the target additional time when I attack. I'm not attacking twice. But that distinction is very fine, and we should really get better terminology for it. And better visualization and like better tool tipping, I think, would all be really good. But ultimately, the distinction here being made is that is a gameplay one. It's we don't want Aurora leaning into attack-based systems. We want her to be focused on casting spells. Now, I think there's a separate argument here that like actually the current modern version of Aurora, who is shaped more towards burst than the original that we shipped, I think arguably it might benefit from like a per target cooldown on her passive, and then having the passive be a little bit more powerful, like defensively speaking, because it has a healing output that many people don't even know exists. But anyway, I think that there's like other versions of Aurora that could make it more clear, like why she's a spellcaster, or like why this attack, like this passive is more tied to spells, and why it's intended to be shaped more for spells. But the goals of the gameplay here are demanding that this is not a on hit effect that can be like replicated by things like Rageblade and Dusk and Dawn. I will say for alternate modes, this is something we've been considering a little bit more. Is like, yeah, it being an on hit would be valuable for alternate modes, right? That think of things like Ethereal Weapon as an example, or say Fan the Hammer, for example, right? So for like alt modes like ARAM Mayhem and Arena, I think there would be value in this being an on-hit effect, because I think the distinction between Aurora as an attacker versus spellcaster is less important there, right? Like the distinctions between different builds are worn down in those modes for sure, and so I think that's something where, hey, maybe we should consider this, and like consider if we have a solve for the core SR gameplay loop, and add some value for modes. That's something we've been talking about doing recently, but anyway, hopefully that's a comprehensive answer there, or like at least a good answer. I don't know if it's comprehensive, but hopefully that's the answer. Answers up the question of like the actual core reason is basically just, yeah, because we want Aurora to be primarily about spellcasting and not about attacking people. Having it be an on attack is important for that, so that she doesn't just trigger her passive on you repeatedly by attacking you, and she actually has to hit her spells, and she cares about haste and all of that. Why are most on hit effects damage and not just effects? So this is one where I ask you to think about what champions are leveraging the on hit system and what do they actually need, right? Look at champions like Kog'Maw, like Callista, like, in the modern day, like a Teemo, but also like a Vayne, right? It's like, what do those champions actually want and what can we give them? Damage, right? Like, that's what the on hit system is currently there to support. It's a foil to the crit system. It is a alternate path to damage on your auto attacks that has other implications on what your like how your champion is going to deal damage. You're going to be more target agnostic than the crit system. You like in some ways you're going to scale worse, but you're going to have better early spikes, right? You're going to have the ability to build up more defenses, right? You're gonna you're gonna have more utility. Now, none of that means that we couldn't have more utility based effects in the on hit system. In fact, I think we should. But you have to understand that in the current game, like the way that we've shaped the on hit system is that it is not a utility system, right? There's an alternate version of the game where we like build the game such that, say, all champion in kit on hit effects, as an example, scale with crit, right? Like this would mean something like Kog'Maw W has a crit scaler on the damage or something, right? And so when Kog'Maw wants to do full damage, he just builds crit. And crit is the way to scale auto attack damage, right? That's a real version of the systems. And in that world, the on hit system could be primarily about utility. But in the current game, that's not how it works, right? That's not how we've structured these champions or these item systems. And so we've had internal explorations before around like what does a more utility based version of the on hit system actually look like in practice. But the actual reality is that's not how we use the current system. And so because of that, we are in a world where the main output of the on hit system must be damage because otherwise we have a bunch of champions that are expecting there to be on hit support that lets them, that extends their damage quite a bit. They're expecting that system to be there, and we'd have to like significantly reshape a bunch of champions in order to make that in order to make that a more heavily utility based system functional at all. Again, though, I do want to be clear that like this doesn't mean that we can't expand to additional functionality, and I think that that's a cool idea. But I will say it's also a really difficult space, right? Think about what you can actually put on an on-hit effect, right? Because this is something that has to be extremely repeatable, but also hopefully somewhat satisfying, right? This is one of the reasons why I think Kraken Slayer having a third hit effect that we can actually like put sound effects and visuals on is really cool. Is even though it's damage, right? It's still it's an on hit effect, but because it's every third hit, it can have visualization, it can have sound effects, and it can be really crunchy and satisfying, and that can be great for it, right? Similarly, Rage Blade has the every 4 hits or whatever. You get the point. But every X hits allows us to concentrate that power somewhere. Something I was talking about a little bit in number 29. If you go back and watch that one, is the human brain doesn't is not going to be as satisfied by a drip of something that happens really frequently as it is by big chunks of something, right? And so this is one of the problems we run into with on-hit effects is that it's hard to make them interesting and satisfying without very much overselling them, right? That's one of the problems that say like Sword of Blossoming Dawn has, is that Sword of Blossoming Dawn is like, oh, it fires a missile at your ally and then it heals them for 37 or whatever, right? And it's like, whatever, right? Who cares about this, right? It's like really not super individually like on an auto by auto basis, not super satisfying or compelling. So it has to like spam VFX, and then that leads it to its own problem of, oh, then we're overselling this thing, and we have all sorts of other issues associated with that. Not saying Sword of Blossoming Dawn doesn't work for Arena, it does, right? But it does have some weaknesses in that area, right? And one of the things we've run into before when we've explored these utility spaces is there's not that many utility effects that you can actually give that can be reasonably applied on every single auto, right? Even if it's only against champions, you're still going to be able to attack. Like you could build a lot of attack speed in League. You can attack a champion pretty frequently, right? And so we end up in this position where then these items need to start being really complicated, where it's like, oh, every 5th hit you do this cool thing, and then it's kind of like, oh, is that even interesting? Like is that still satisfying when you do a 3 auto trade with someone and your item did nothing or did very little because it offered you 20 on hit damage and then this big payout on a 5th hit or whatever, right? That's utility based, and Again, I'm not saying these problems are not are not mitigatable or resolvable. It's just there's a lot of problems in this space because there's not that many things you can give on an auto by auto basis that are actually satisfying, even intellectually speaking. Right? As an example, it's like imagine a world where I tell you, oh well, you can shred someone's like armor and MR by 2% per auto. It's like okay, and that stacks up to 15 times. Wow, that's really like theoretically powerful in the optimal case, but in the actual reality of League of Legends, it's actually not that good, and it's not very going to be very satisfying. Even intellectually, it's like, well, how often are you auto attacking someone 15 times, right? Um, and so we run into issues around these kinds of things where, oh, every fifth auto you get a shield or something like that, and it's like, is that even interesting, right? Like, is that cool? Um, there's just tough issues to resolve. Um, and the on hit system is currently pretty like structurally important to the game. It's like it's supporting some pretty important stuff right now. And so because of that, uh, we don't have a lot of utility effects in the on hit system, and it's primarily about damage. Um, Not saying that couldn't change in the future or that we couldn't have more utility effects. I suspect that ultimately, what this probably looks like in the future is not here's a bunch of items that just offer only utility, but more here are some on hit items that offer damage, but also some form of utility as well. That's interesting. Is probably much more likely. But yeah, it's the kind of thing that's like why are they like this? Well, because it's structurally important for the game that these a bunch of these champions have damage support for them on their auto attacks that is not crit, right? Because we don't want to make Kog'Maw's W skill with crit. That's a less cool version of the champion than him having an entire item system that he has access to that lets him scale his W in a unique and interesting way, right? And so that's why this system is structured the way that it is. But that doesn't mean that the system couldn't be better. I think it absolutely could be. Are champion inherent stat buff to item interactions dangerous? And this person was talking about like how Vagar interacts with like the AP ratios on items, for example. My quick answer to this is like they're not that dangerous, and it's very easy for us to account for them when we're designing champions and when we're designing items. It is something that definitely comes up, and it definitely causes us to take different directions in some cases, right? As an example, I've talked about this before, but Mordekaiser, we actually had him getting AP per level at one point in development as a replacement for the like total like the combo that most juggernauts like AD juggernauts have, which is they have total AD ratios and then they get a ton of AD per level so that their damage scales with their level, even if they're not putting points into that damaging ability. And to represent that at one point in development, we were using AP per level, which by the way, I don't know if I've ever talked about this before, but AP per level is actually just like a stat that we have access to. It like it's completely handled by the engine functionally, but we don't use it anywhere. Like it works 100%. But we don't it's just set to zero on every single champion. But like if we wanted to, we could just like hot fix one AP per level onto someone or any number of AP per level onto a champion. It's very easy to do. Anyway, irrelevant tangents aside, uh, we moved away from that on Mordekaiser at the time because of the way that it was interacting, and it leaned him more towards burst because of the way that it was interacting with Lichbane. I suspect, looking back, that actually that probably would have been fine if Mordekaiser had been even remotely balanced. Like the actual reality was just his damage was so high that, of course, he was leaning into Lichbane at that time. It wasn't just the AP per level that was leaning him that way. It was also just that his damage was really overtuned. And so, I think conflating some things that may not have been related, though it's hard to say, right? Like, we could, it's possible that, uh, that wasn't the case. I'm not sure. Either way, though, what we found is that these interactions really don't end up being that problematic. It's just like, yep. I was concerned about this, for example, when I made the Endless Hunger. I was like, oh man, like this is an AD to haste ratio. Is this going to be really messed up on Riven and Aatrox, who can multiply their AD by a ton, right? Because we've had some similar like here's a bonus AD ratio on an item that we moved away from previously because of Riven and Aatrox being able to scale their ADs to such crazy levels. Um, and we tested a bunch of it was like, I mean, they get a lot of like they get a big number out of it, and it makes the item good on them. But that it's just like not a problem, right? It just doesn't end up like the differences in item usage between champions end up being kind of spiky and rocky and like highly variant enough that it's rare that we actually run into real problematic like cases with this. Most of the time, it's just oh yeah, well, sure, Riven gets more value from the AD ratio here, but the stat spread is actually really, really, really good for Hecarim, and so Hecarim absolutely loves Endless Hunger. In fact, actually likes it even more than Riven does, even though Riven theoretically has way more synergy with the AD to haste ratio, Hecarim is getting more out of the other parts of the item, and so therefore it's actually even better on him, right? Even though he doesn't have an AD steroid. And so generally my perspective on this is it's not really a problem that we run into too often. It does cause us to reconsider some shapes from time to time. I question how often we actually really need to do that, because typically when we say, hey, we're willing to accept this as a risk and we ship it, it generally doesn't manifest as a problem. But we do mess around. We do play around these things a bit. I've cut some item designs because I was like, I don't want to deal with this problem interacting with this specific champion before, but never in a case where I really thought the item would be super 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 high value. If I made it work, right? Like Endless Hunger is an example where it's like, well, I thought the item would be really high value, so I was willing to take risks on it, and that panned out just fine. And so I think there's a lot more concern in this area than there is actual, like, real problematic interaction. There are cases where we've had to make changes in the past, and one example I think we're running into right now on live is Ryze's passive gives him such a synergy with mana ratios that it's causing problems with like Actualizer and mana ratios in alt game modes, right? Like Overflow and Mind to Matter, etc. And so that's a case where, yeah, maybe we should change Ryze's passive to do something else, or maybe we should just nerf it and buff him in other areas so that he doesn't have such an overwhelming advantage on interacting with mana and other champions. But overall, like, are they dangerous? A little bit, but not overly so. And also, sorry if you could hear that bing. That's my oven telling me that my food is done. So let me go do that. But yeah, let's move on to the next question. Good timing, thank you. So let's. I'm gonna go eat my chicken and then I'll answer these questions afterwards. Alrighty, chicken has been eaten. I am full and ready to answer some more questions. Let's get in here, starting out again with why is tanks max health damage mostly magic damage? The short answer to this is that most of our tanks are magic damage dealers. We have a couple of hybrid-ish champions like Ornn and Sejuani, and we have a few primary physical damage tanks, Scion, Cassante, and Poppy. But most of our other tanks, right, the Zacs, the Amumus, the Brahms, the Leonas, are primarily magic damage, right? And so why are most of our tanks magic damage? Actually, well, I'll point out, of our three primary physical damage tanks, Cassante and Poppy both have physical max health damage. Just something to note there. But why are most of our tanks magic damage? There's a few reasons for this. Some of it is theming, right? Like it's easier to theme someone like a Mumu as magic damage, right? Like than physical, right? Like tanks, tend to have a lot of CC effects, and it tends to be a lot easier to theme CC as magical rather than physical, right? Like how many physical CCs are really like well themed? That tends to be like knockups, right? Is the easiest way of doing that, right? Like Yasuo Q3, it's like a physical tornado coming at you. But anyway, we don't need to get into all of that. So some of this is theming. Some of it is also game structure, where the way that the game is structured, we have we have the physical resistance, which is armor, and magic resistance, which is magic resist, are not the same, right? They're not equal, right? Champions generally gain a lot more armor over game time than they do MR, right? All champions, I think, have more armor per level than MR, except for Thresh, I guess, who obviously gets armor from his souls instead. And so, generally speaking, the like physical damage scales worse if you're not investing into it than magic damage. And so that's one of the things that we do with tanks is we say, okay, well, we want you to, if we're giving you max health damage, it probably is supposed to be fine throughout the game. And so it's easier to make that magic damage because that makes it so that the damage is likely to maintain a similar level of power throughout the game, right? Whereas stuff like Poppy Q and Cassante's passive actually don't scale as well because people get a lot more armor, right? In the current modern day, people like even squishies get up to like 90 plus armor by the time they hit level 18. And even back in the day, be 70 plus or 80 plus, even for squishies for armor. Whereas MR doesn't get nearly that high on champions. And so unless they're building resistances specifically against that damage type, magic damage is just more consistent for non-damage dealing champions, right? Obviously, this changes if you're building, penetration and shred and all of that kind of stuff, or if you have one of those in your kit. But for the most part, the main reason behind this is just, well, this is a more consistent type of damage that tends to fit in like themed, like it tends to be more well themed for these kinds of effects that tanks have. And so we have more tanks that are primary magic damage dealers. And so we therefore make their magic damage, max health or their max health damage, magic damage more frequently because it makes more sense. That's really all there is to it. It's really not too complicated. But yeah, that's what I've got to say about that. I think it would be nice if stat charts were interchangeable. Say I want three 10% attack speed charts for whatever reason. So there's a lot of reasons why we don't do this, right? Why we have it set up the way that we have it set up right now, which is three choices, three separate choices of one of three, rather than like three of the same one out of eight. If we were offering the same stats as an example, and or I guess it'd be one out of seven because two of them are repeated stats. Anyway, um, so what about that? Like, what's the difference here, right? It's like, first of all, there's three different decisions being made, right? Which for the optimizers actually ends up being, in a lot of cases, more interesting. And secondarily, it allows us to give a spread of stats and not concentrate all those stats in one area, right? This is one of the problems that these types of systems, like the super free, like super loose systems have, right? Like, you can imagine a world where we very easily, like very quickly run into problems around like, tuning champions, especially tuning early games, when we allow champions to have like stack as much of any given one stat that they want in this stat chart system. It's like, okay, so now we have to worry about what happens at level 1 when Tom Kench takes triple flat health, or what happens at level 1 when Callista takes triple attack speed, or what happens at level 1 when Draven takes triple adaptive, or whatever, right? Insert your favorite, champion that has a extreme scaling with a stat and extreme level, like early game pattern, not even just level 1, but just like, early level pattern. The fact that we spread these stats out, it gives us a really nice method of asking people to make choices that are interesting, right? Like between flat health and health per level, for example, which is interesting even on, a squishy, and also allows us to, give you a spread of interesting stats which will be relevant for your champion, but might not necessarily be the best thing ever for your champion, right? It's like the actual reality of if we let you pick the same thing multiple times, the actual reality is that even though there are linear returns on a given stat, your champion is often going to just want the same thing three times, which is actually way less interesting than picking three different stats, or the same stat twice potentially if you're taking like double adaptive or something like that, or double health per level. And as a different choice in the third slot, right? Because you have to make that choice. You don't get the option to just pick the same thing again, which actually ends up being a lot less interesting in a lot of cases. Also, another thing to be concerned about here is you have to worry about junglers optimizing their clears, right? Where most junglers probably can't take defensive stats then because they have to take damage to optimize their clear. And so you start going down this path of like, oh, all junglers have now shifted from being more durable to being like more having more damage, and similar things would likely happen for AD carries, right? Like, good example of what happens in this case when you do this, even if we had diminishing returns as an example on picking the same thing multiple times. One of the things we saw that ended up being kind of problematic in the old rune system, even for like blues as an example, for those of you who are familiar with the old blue system, or sorry, the old rune system, in blues, the most efficient thing you could take was either flat MR or MR per level. But a lot of people playing mages or AD carries would start taking damage optimizations in the blues, even though they weren't that efficient. And it's not to say that they were wrong. They probably were, but those players would often get really frustrated by getting bursted out. It's like, oh man, I got one shot by that Orianna, and the Orianna only has like an item and a half, and it's like, well, you don't have any MR, right? Like you literally didn't take MR, and so there's a lot of things about the pacing of the game and the structure of the game that I think are really good when we require people to get a spread of different stats, and especially when we require people to take a defensive, like some kind of defensive output. I think there's a lot of positives to that. And so in our current rune structure, I think it's really unlikely that we would ever say like, oh, take three of whatever stat shard you want. Even beyond the tuning problems that would cause around, like we'd have to retune a lot of champions early games and probably make a lot of champions less interesting, where it's like, yeah, Draven Axes have to be tuned around him having triple adaptive at level 1. Tom Kench passive has to be tuned around him taking triple flat health, et cetera, et cetera. And we'd actually end up making a lot of those more extreme outlier champions. We'd actually end up having to make them less interesting because we have to nerf the thing that makes them interesting in order to tune it around the system existing. So that part seems like a pretty sharp negative to me. But also this lets people feel good about making the right choices, right? Like as an example, you're playing Sivir into Draven. You should take flat health, of course, right? Like you're going to get brutalized in the laning phase. Draven's just going to axe you over and over and over again, right? But at 25 minutes, you're not thinking about the laning phase that you played out very much, right? Especially if if it went okay for you, and you might feel bad about not having attack speed or adaptive if you actually could make that choice, right? But in this world, all you have to think is like, well, I had to take a defensive choice. Clearly, this was a game for flat health, right? Like, of course, I was not supposed to take health per level in this game, and so Generally, I think there's a lot of small reasons that kind of add up to like why we don't want to give complete freedom of choice in this system. And ultimately, I think that you can look at the old rune system for like and see a lot of the problems that come alongside giving this much freedom of choice. The old rune system tried to give diminishing returns on a lot of those stats in order to get people to generally take certain types of defenses, certain types of offensive effects, and certain types of utility effects in the system. And this is not to say the old rune system was perfect at doing that. I think it had some pretty clear flaws, right? Like we could have probably cut like half the runes out of the game and then like buffed half the remaining ones and nerfed a couple of the remaining ones. The system would have been a lot better. It could have been, I think, improved a lot by numbers tuning. But structurally speaking, the old rune system had a lot of problems that would have been present in it, because of this effect of, allowing people to stack whatever they want is often going to make them feel bad about making the right choice, or make them feel bad about making the choice that actually makes sense in the game that they're in. And there's, that's just like not that not that desirable ultimately, for like the structure of these like low interest stat systems like this. And so I think you're unlikely to see something like this in the future, at least not in the rune system. I think other systems, obviously open season, right? It depends on how the system is being used and what the structure is supposed to be. Are mana costs generally lower now than they were in the past? What if they get lower in the future? So I identify two large factors in why mana like feels like it's less significant than it has been in the past. One is in the patch that added mythic items to the game, we gave a lot of champions 20 mana per level, and we've never undone this, right? A lot of champions that either we didn't want to build mana on their mythic, or previously were buying mana and we wanted them to potentially have non-mana mythic options. We gave them 20 mana per level to make them less reliant upon mana in the item system. And this was a lot of champions. You can go look up the patch. I forget what patch it is exactly, but you can go look it up. It's a lot of champions, a lot of Sheen champions. It's a lot of tanks that previously sometimes bought like stuff like Frozen Heart, or like Catalyst items. And so a lot of champions just have more mana per level. And you have to figure, like, you have to think about this, like, mana per level, especially significant amounts of it, kind of feeds into itself. Because it's not just when you level up, you get more mana. It's every time you come out of base, you have more mana, right? Think about it this way. It's like, oh, if you're level 5 and you base, it's not just that when you level up in the future, you get an extra 20 mana when you level up. It's, well, when you come out of base, you're coming to lane with an extra, 70-ish mana, because you don't actually get exactly your stat growth per level. There's the stat growth formula, so it's a little bit less at early levels. I don't know how much mana it is at level 5. It's probably like 70. So you have an extra 70 mana, which means you can cast more spells, which means you can stay on the map longer. Which means because you're staying on out on the map longer, you can level up more, which gives you more access to your mana per level, which is higher, right? And so it's sort of a self-perpetuating system for these champions that have higher mana per level now than they did in the past. And so because of that, a lot of those champions feel a lot less restricted in their usage of mana than they did before, which makes sense because they literally just have access to a lot more mana, right? Another big systemic factor that affects this that's much more recent is the changes to Home Guard, right? The more powerful Home Guard, which means that basing is a little bit lower of a cost, right? Than it was in previous seasons. And so because of the more powerful Home Guard, you can base a little bit more easily and return to lane. And so the strategy of dumping your mana and using your mana inefficiently and then spam basing, especially in mid lane, is a bit more powerful today than has been in the past. And that's something that we, one of the reasons why we have the rules, like some of the rules on the role quests about like staying in your lane. One of the reasons we have that is to prevent the optimal mid lane strategy from being, oh, I just show up, I instantly blast the wave with all of my mana, spam my abilities, and then I just spam base. And this obviously there are some cases where that's good on live right now, but that's one of the things that we've built a little bit of protection against in the role quests. That was like something that we were very focused on when we were working on these version of Home Guards. Is like, hey, we don't want it to be the primary thing that you do in mid lane to be just like show up, dump your mana, base, and then run back to lane, right? And that was one of the things that caused us to change the quest boots, the like with the enhanced recall being removed from the first version, was like that was really optimal. Like saving 4 seconds on your on your base was enabling that pattern. It's like generally we don't want to support that as being the primary mid lane pattern. I think generally if that's something that's rarely optimal, it can be okay, especially for certain specific champions, but we don't want that to be the default strategy, right? Anyway, so those are the two major factors. I don't think it's mostly that mana costs are lower. There are definitely some champions where mana costs are lower, and some champions that I think have mana costs that are too low in general, that are not dependent upon building, they're too independent of building mana. But that's not like sort of directly related to this. It's just the systemic factors of people feeling like mana is less relevant today. I think that's true, but I don't think it's because of mana cost for the most part. There might be some individual champions where that's true, but I think the general case, the most of the influences those two factors that I was just talking about. Now, what if they get lower in the future, and just generally talking about like what this means for the game? I am generally a fan of, like, comparatively to, say, 7 or 8 years ago. I think it's correct that mana is less important now. It's less of a constraint because we have a lot of resourceless or like non mana resource champions that have a lot of advantages on mana champions kind of naturally. And mana is important as a restriction for certain kits. One of the ones I use as an example a lot is like Cassante. It's like, yeah, Cassante, if he didn't have mana, his E cooldown would need to be a lot higher, and his W would probably have to be way less powerful, especially in the early lane. We get to have a champion who has a really powerful set of abilities because he has mana, and that enables him to have some really powerful, really good feeling spells for the laning phase. Similarly, like someone like Fizz, right? It's like Fizz, his E mana cost is really important. It's important that he can't just use his E over and over and over again to dodge every spell that you throw at him, and that eventually that means that he has to base, right? It's like structurally, I think it's pretty important for a lot of these champions that there is a high cost, right? Like, as an example, if Yasuo had mana, his W probably would be a much lower cooldown and it would have a really high mana cost. He obviously doesn't have mana. He'd be structured. I think his kit would be structured very differently if he did. But there's like different versions of champion kit structure for mana versus non-mana, because mana gives us a lever to pull to say, like, in the laning phase, you don't get to spam this ability. But I think mana for most champions doesn't need to be super relevant outside the laning phase. Obviously, for some it does, right? Like Kassadin, for example, has a whole loop, revolving around his mana. It's important that mana matters for him outside the laning phase as well, right? But in general, I do think that we should be more intentional about which champions should or should not have their mana gating, like, limited in like at which point in the game. A lot of the things that we've done around mana have been, sort of related, like directly targeted at other areas of the game, or like, for unrelated reasons, right? Like, for example, the mana per level that we gave in the mythic system was like, it was about item incentives and the way that champions are incentivized to buy, one item over another. Not really about the mana itself, or like whether we wanted the mana costs to go away at any specific point, or to be relevant at any specific point. The home guard stuff had nothing to do with mana itself. It was about how much of the game do you spend in action versus, like, in downtime, like walking, returning from base and stuff, right? Not about mana itself, right? And so I think this is something that in the future we could definitely consider taking a pass on a lot of champions around, like, do you have the right mana costs at the right phase of the game? Are you tuned correctly? Another thing that I'll note is that champions actually have very, very different mana pools and like relation to mana in the item system. Some champions have very small mana, like very, very low amounts of mana and very low mana costs. And that makes it so that mana in the item system is very powerful on them, because the mana in the item system for the most part is flat, right? Whereas some champions have very large pools and very high costs, and then therefore the mana from the item system doesn't help them as much, right? Because the mana from the item system, again, is flat. And so it's like, if your spell costs 130 mana, buying a 600 mana Lost Chapter item doesn't help you as much as someone whose primary spell is like 50 mana, but their base mana pool is half or whatever, right? So it's a lot of different things to talk about here. I do think that there are some champions that could benefit from a deeper look. Like, I honestly, a lot of mages, especially, that could benefit from a deeper look of, like, when should your mana costs stop mattering very much? Because I think most of our mana limitations, end up being for the laning phase. There are exceptions, right? I think that someone like Xerath, as an example, is someone who, like, or Ziggs as an example. A lot of our artillery mages, we don't want them to just be able to fire their abilities, forever at the edge of their range and just, like, wait until they, like, fish until they eventually hit something. We want there to be some cost associated with that. But a lot of other champions, it's like, well, outside of the laning phase, we don't really care about these restrictions, right? Like, for example, if after 15 minutes we just snapped our fingers and said, Fizz, you don't have mana anymore, your spells don't cost anything, I don't think that would actually be, like, structurally wrong for the champion, right? Like, that seems like fine to me. I think the reason why Fizz needs mana costs is mostly because of the laning phase. And it probably is good that there's, like, a reason why he has to base besides his health or besides having gold later on in the game. I think for pacing reasons and for game structure reasons, there's some positives to that. But I don't think it's particularly structurally important that a lot of, especially the melees, have those mana restrictions later on. And even a lot of the mages, I think we say, like, once you get 600 mana from your Lost Chapter item, it's not that important that we super mana gate you, especially if you're one of the lower range mages, right? Like a battle mage or something like that. It's not that important that you have a real, like, meaningful mana limitation. And so this is the case where I think there are some champions that could probably have lower mana costs. There are some champions that probably should have higher mana costs and should have that power in other areas. But it's something where this version of the system that we have, like mana wise, is currently working. Could it be better? Yeah, sure. Almost any system could be better. And this is one where we've made a lot of changes that have affected mana for other reasons, right? Not focused on mana as the primary goal. And I suspect at some point we might want to do a project that does focus on mana as the primary goal of, like, let's get mana into the best place it could possibly be. Because I don't think that it currently is. I think there are definitely some champions that are off in terms of their current mana costs. And their current mana costs over game time, especially. Is it worth making it viable for supports to run double ward instead of sweeper? So this might surprise some people. This is a topic that's actually been discussed a lot internally around what should we do with like the interaction of these, like the support Sightstone plus the warding trinket. We tested something at one point where supports would, when you upgraded your support item, it would automatically switch you to sweeper. We tested something where we would upgrade your warding trinket when you had a Sightstone to make it drop pinks. Obviously, that's kind of invalidated now by the role quest. But we've tried a lot of things in this space, and our conclusion has generally been that none of the things that we've tried have been clear value up or clearly worth it. I think this is sort of one of those small annoyances, kind of like ear flicky things. That's, hey, if we have a clean solution that feels good for the support player, cool. Should we spend a lot of time and effort resolving this problem? No, probably not, right? Like, we talked about it a good amount, but the ultimate reality is it's pretty important that, like, as an example, one of the solutions that's been suggested is like, oh, what if the warding trinket and the Sightstone had separate ward limits? Well, it's actually pretty important that one person, like for the structure of the way that we have the vision system structured, it's pretty important that one person cannot cover a very large percentage of the map in wards, and it's important that, like, the support has limitations on how much vision they can actually place on their own. A deeper structural problem, I think, that this is related to, by the way, is that sweeper is just really powerful. Like, sweeper is just better than warding trinket as the game goes on, right? It's like, you look, especially at higher levels of skill, you'll notice that over time people start replacing their warding trinkets with sweepers more and more aggressively as you go up and up in skill. And you'll generally see, like, a lot of high skill games, especially in pro, will end with 4 sweepers and 1 blue trinket on both teams, or maybe 1 warding trinket, or maybe 2 blue trinkets for the losing team, something like that, right? Sweeper is just a much more powerful effect later on in the game. One of the goals of Phalites was to make it more viable to maintain your warding trinket, because of course it would still trigger Phalites, and that would make it so you could set up vision for yourself in the side lane. I think that helped a little bit, but probably wasn't enough on its own. And so part of the identification here is of a deeper, like, I think a deeper problem issue here of, like, sweeper is just way better than warding trinket in terms of game time scaling. It's just so much better later on in the game. And the warding trinket just really falls off. But we don't want to give people super powerful, vision, the ability to, like, just generate tons and tons and tons of vision on their own later on in the game without, having access to a Sightstone. And so we're in a tough spot here where the vision removal tool just is so much more, like, objectively powerful later on in the game. And so it doesn't even make sense even for a support. And that's why we haven't made a lot of these changes. It's like, well, we could make it viable, but ultimately they're probably going to switch to sweeper anyway, because we're not going to give them access to a tool that's anywhere close to as powerful as their Sightstone on their trinket slot. Anyway, a lot of overlapping issues here. But I just wanted to note, like, this is something that we've actually talked about a lot internally as, yeah, this is something that's annoying, and we would love to find a good, clean solution, but we haven't found one that we've been happy with that makes it so that supports don't feel bad about, like, not immediately switching to sweeper. The ultimate reality is, like, once you get good enough at the game, almost no one should not swap to sweeper later on in the game. Like, pretty much everyone should have a sweeper, and then one person should have a blue trinket, probably. Sometimes not even that, right? Yeah, this is sort of I think a problem that exists sort of overlapping with a number of different issues, but ultimately one that I kind of look at and I say, yeah, it would be nice if we could find a good resolution, a good, clean resolution for this, but not something I think we should spend tons and tons and tons of time on, because it is actually representative or influenced by another like overlapping systemic issue. Why does glowing mote cost this much? So glowing mote is tuned such that it's not particularly powerful on its own as a component for, I think, two main reasons. The first one is that the cheaper a basic item is, the worse it is, right? That's just true. It's true of all of our other basic items. And structurally, that's important because it makes it so that bigger bases where you have more gold are more powerful, right? Like the person who saves up 1,300 gold and bases for a BF sword should be more powerful than the person who based 4 times to buy 4 separate long swords, right? That's the 4 separate long swords are more expensive than the BF sword, and the BF sword is therefore more efficient and more powerful because you had to hold all that gold at the same time, right? You didn't spam base and get advantages out of that, right? It's a reward for holding gold in inventory and staying out on the map and taking risks, right? Not immediately getting value out of your gold. And so glowing mote, because it's one of the cheapest basic items in the game, tied for the cheapest basic item in the game, is not going to be allowed to be that powerful because there you can basically always add a glowing mote. Like it's 250 gold, right? You can almost always add a glowing mote to any purchase that you already have, and get some marginal value out of that, right? The opportunity cost for doing that is almost nothing, right? And so because of that, we end up at this situation where uh, it can't be that efficient. Now, could it be more efficient than it currently is? Probably, right? But there's a second problem we ran into, which is haste is different than other stats, right? Letting people efficiently stack longswords, to give them some powerful early game damage, is very different from letting people efficiently stack early game haste, right? Haste is a very different stat than a lot of our other spells because it affects your kit in a very in a way that makes the kit more frequent, and it actually enable like certain haste breakpoints enable some combos and sequences that aren't otherwise possible, right? And so one of the concerns, if we have a particularly efficient haste basic item, is stacking that to hit those haste breakpoints or hit those thresholds can potentially become a highly optimized strategy for some champions, right? Like Vlad is a good example, or like Gragas is a really good example where, this allows them to mitigate a core weakness of an intended weakness of the champion, or break some intended weakness that they have that is supposed to go away at some point later on in the game, but they might be able to access that too early in the game if we made a super efficient basic haste item, right? That allowed them to stack up a lot of haste super efficiently early on in the game, right? You saw this with like codex stacking that people were doing, what was that, like 4 or 5 years ago, something like that, on a few champions, like Gragas as an example. And when the haste gets too efficient at too low of a price, that can be problematic for breaking down some of the gameplay patterns these champions are intended to have. And so glowing mode is not super efficient. Neither is dagger, right? Like dagger is not a particularly exciting component because it's also 250. That's just the reality of having really cheap basic items, and also this being haste specifically can be pretty pattern warping if we offered a lot of it on at a too low of a price. So that ends up being why glowing mote costs this much. Oh, actually, coming back, bonus that I didn't actually mention here. If people are asking why choose a super cheap version of it, it's so that we can have a lower efficiency version of it, right? To be clear. Yeah. Sorry, just adding that on there, right? Because I didn't explain because it could be that glowing mote could be more efficient at 500 gold, but the risk then is that we run into the stacking them as potentially optimal on a bunch of champions and warps a bunch of gameplay patterns. If I didn't explain that fully, sorry. Why does Muramana have a range mod if no melee user buys it? So the thinking here is kind of backwards a little bit, right? Where the melee mod is advantageous, right? Where it just makes it better for melees. It doesn't make any different for range champions, right? Great example of usage of this in the current game, like from recent times, is we added a melee range split to Endless Hunger this season. It's the same as it was before for range champions. It's just better on melees because melees generally are asking more from their items. They need more because they're at such a innate disadvantage in League. And so Muramana having a melee mod is there to try and make it so that we can support some melee usage. And we have had this at times in the past, right? There's been times when Ilaoi bought Manamune. There's been times when Kane bought Manamune. There's been times when Hecarim bought Manamune. We have Jace, who obviously isn't normally melee, but can benefit a little bit from the melee mod. And I think it's arguable, totally a reasonable argument, that we could potentially add a more powerful melee mod to Manamune, such that it could be even more powerful on melees than it currently is, and maintain its same exact power level on range, such that we could potentially pick up a few more melee users. Now, that having been said, I think what we found historically is that this item, which has only damage and also is scaling, is a little bit awkward for melees, right? It's a scaling item that requires you to stack a bunch, but it only offers offensive stats. It's sort of an awkward combination of like stats bundle for melee champions, particularly because it's not a lethality item or anything, right? It's an AD and haste item. So most of our casters either don't have mana like Riven or Aatrox or whatever, like our AD melee casters, or they're not really interested in a scaling item. They just want their power now. Give it to me now, right? Like you look at champions like again Aatrox, Riven, um, Hecarim to a lesser extent. There have been versions of Hecarim that were more about scaling, like more about like a 2 or 3 item spike, and those are the versions of Hecarim, that were more interested in Manamune or Muramana or whatever we're calling it here. But the shape is a little bit awkward because it doesn't offer any defenses. I think that there is potentially an item design out there that is an AD castery melee item that offers a little bit of defenses, that like version of Manamune for that, right? And that version of Manamune probably is okay for some of the ranged users like Ezreal as well, right? Ezreal is a fine user of items with a little bit of durability on them as well. So is like Jace, right? It's like we could put a Kindle gem into Muramana, for example. And that might even be appropriate for some of the champions. But at the same time, I think it's actually pretty cool that we have this pure damage option. And so maybe the argument here is actually we're supposed to have another AD tier mana item that offers some defenses and has a different effect that has some particular interest for some of these AD castery melee champions. And maybe that's supposed to have an even sharper melee mod. But ultimately, the answer is like, well, it's to make it more attractive to melees. Maybe that lever hasn't been pulled hard enough, right? But that's the goal. And the melee mod doesn't affect the ranged champions at all, right? Aside from Jace, of course. And so there's no downside to having a ranged melee split on an item if there's no melee users, and we're leaving it the same for ranged, right? This is much the same way that like when we talk about something like the ranged melee split on Kraken Slayer, having no ranged melee split on Kraken Slayer doesn't mean that the item will be better for ranged. It will be the same for ranged. It's just a more powerful item for melees because that's what it takes to get them to buy it. And in the Manamune case, it seems like the melee mod that we currently have on the item is not quite powerful enough in order to get actual melee users. And I think we attribute that to the stat line the item has is quite awkward for most of the potential users, and that's why they don't buy it. It's not that the effect is not powerful, it's that the stat line and the combination of effects is not quite what these champions are looking for, and we don't want to buff it into, we wouldn't want to like double the melee value, for example, and then suddenly, oh yeah, this just leads to degenerate like one-shotting on melees or whatever. Right now, maybe there's a value between twice what it is now and maybe 20% more damage for melees, or I don't know what the exact numbers are, 33% more power for melees is enough to get Hecarim to buy it and feel good about it or something like that. I don't know, right? Like I don't know who the current best melee user is that isn't buying it. Not sure. Probably Kassadin. I think Kassadin was buying this earlier this season. I don't know if he still is, but anyway, that's ultimately the answer here, is that I think people look at these ranged melee splits kind of backwards in a lot of ways, of like, oh, this is a nerf for ranged. And that's not actually what it is. Ranged melee splits generally are just buffs for melees so that melees have access to this item, right? And again, I think the example of where this is working is Kraken Slayer, where it's like, yep, Kraken Slayer has some melee users that like this item that would not buy the item if it had no ranged melee split. It would just be tuned exclusively around the ranged users. And so Manamune is in a case where, hey, maybe we should consider buffing it for melees and seeing what happens. And, maybe we should try it internally and see like, okay, who is the best user? What happens when we buff it? I suspect in the current game, it just means that Kassadin likes it even more. And we're probably pretty far from other melee users, but I could definitely be wrong about that. It's not something I've spent a ton of time thinking about super deeply or anything like that. So hopefully that answers the question comprehensively. Anyway, that's going to be it for number 30. The big 3-0 today. Hope everybody enjoyed this, and looks like, yeah, I'm actually going to have to fill out the doc soon. This probably isn't enough questions for number 31, so probably before number 30 or 31, I'll probably go through my question suggestions in the Discord and bring up a new bunch of questions to put into this doc. So yeah, if you want to get your questions in, now is a good time to hop in the Discord and put them in there, because I'll be looking at them in probably the next 3 or 4 weeks. to do this stuff. Or not 3 or 4. What am I talking about? Probably the next 2 weeks, actually. Well, definitely the next 2 weeks, maybe the next 1 week. But yeah, thanks for watching, and maybe catch you next time.